The morning routine shattered when Soviet artillery started pounding the horizon. Panicked clerks grabbed heavy folders full of prisoner records and threw them straight onto the concrete floor. The earth shook so violently under their leather boots that the female guards could barely stand straight. By the 2nd of May, 1945, the Red Army had completely encircled Ravensbrück. The vast concrete compound that spent years grinding down thousands of women was rapidly collapsing in on itself. In a matter of minutes, the unquestioned masters of the camp realized they had suddenly become the prey. Berlin lay just 80 kilometers to the south, and its garrison was already surrendering to Soviet forces. The total fall of the capital meant an immediate death sentence for anyone caught wearing the gray uniform. Over 130,000 prisoners had passed through these electrified gates over the previous 6 years. This left behind a mountain of damning evidence that the administrative staff now frantically tried to erase. But the sheer volume of their brutal crimes made hiding impossible, and blind panic replaced their cold discipline. The guards had exactly 24 hours left until the advancing tanks finally breached the outer perimeter. Their time was up. The once arrogant overseers ripped the insignias off their collars and bolted out the main gates. Desperate female guards abandoned their fortified watchtowers and sprinted blindly into the surrounding woods. Commandant Fritz Sören faced a nightmare far worse than incoming artillery shells. His biggest problem was his own massive staff. 80 kilometers. That was the exact distance separating his camp from the advancing Soviet army. Sören stared blindly at his tactical maps. The Red Army had already crushed the German defenses at the Oder River. Moving tens of thousands of starving inmates while maintaining strict operational security presented a complete logistical dead end. Ravensbrück held female prisoners since 1939. Now the administration completely collapsed. 550 women in gray uniforms. That matched the size of a standard frontline infantry battalion. But this specific battalion consisted entirely of female executioners. Most of them had joined the camp for basic civilian survival. They wanted a steady paycheck. They needed free housing during a brutal war. They never expected to answer for their daily atrocities. In the cramped guard barracks, the air grew incredibly heavy. It smelled of stale sweat and raw panic. The overseers looked down at their sharply tailored skirts and jackets. A terrifying realization hit them all at once. The prestigious SS fabric was now a bright target painted directly on their backs. They were no longer the untouchable masters of life and death. The trap finally snapped shut. Why did they not just walk away? The escape routes were completely blocked. Patrols still hang fleeing soldiers. Stepping outside those gates on the 1st of May was pure suicide. Beyond the barbed wire, a continuous drone vibrated through the air. Civilian refugees and broken army units choked every dirt road. You could not move. And these women had a fatal problem: their gray uniforms. Male guards could easily ditch their tunics and blend right into the endless streams of defeated infantry. The women had nowhere to hide. Thousands of surviving prisoners knew their faces. They were obvious targets for the advancing Soviet troops. Panic took hold. Desperate whispers echoed in the dark over stolen paper maps. Fingers traced narrow forest paths. Old friendships died. Every guard calculated her own survival. But sneaking away without forged travel documents meant facing the ruthless German military police. The front collapsed. No one ran. Desertion carried a mandatory death sentence by firing squad. The clerks of the records department worked fast. They hurled hundreds of thick folders straight into the red-hot furnaces. Since the blocked roads made a quick getaway impossible, the guards attacked the next biggest threat: the camp archives. This paper trail held the exact evidence that would send them straight to the gallows. They built the fire methodically. Women in crisp uniforms sorted through towering stacks of evidence. They tossed bundles of documents into the roaring flames. Black smoke poured out of the brick chimney. The choking smell of burning paper filled the cramped offices. Outside, thick flakes of gray ash drifted down onto the empty parade ground. They did not destroy things randomly. They sorted their guilt. Personal files of the female guards fed the fire first. Next came the signed execution orders. Finally, they dragged out the heavy binders detailing the medical experiments. Taking the time to prioritize these surgical logs over routine logistics proved a cold reality. They knew exactly which atrocities violated international law. They understood the lethal weight of the sulfanilamide injection reports. This facility processed over 130,000 women. The paperwork was massive. The clerks kept feeding the iron stoves until the heat became unbearable. The last folders flew into the fire. Fingertips ripped glossy paper. The sharp sound of tearing photographs echoed down the halls. Smiling faces in SS uniforms became confetti. State archives burning outside were not the only problem on May 2nd. Every overseer hid a personal death sentence right inside her nightstand. Parents had sent them letters from home. Mothers praised their daughters for doing hard, important work for the regime. Those proud words were now lethal. One guard burned a picture of herself laughing beside a watchtower. Then the panic spread. A massive purge swept the barracks. They grabbed their diaries. They shredded private notes. Women who had methodically managed the deaths of thousands now applied that exact same cold calculation to erase themselves. They stripped off their uniforms. They had to become nobody. Fast. The sun came up. Drawers slammed shut. The wooden nightstands now held exactly 0 pieces of evidence. How did these women sleep at night after working in the death camp? They simply convinced themselves they were actively protecting the prisoners. While their military photographs turned to ash inside the iron stoves, the female guards desperately needed to invent a completely new reality in their heads. As the cold morning of May 2nd approached, they packed their suitcases and shared bizarre stories of their own mercy. Conversations in the barracks centered around one narrative. They only followed strict commands and possessed 0 personal choice. Others claimed they had secretly helped the starving inmates whenever the brutal commanders allowed it. Their favorite excuse revolved entirely around keeping basic discipline and preventing violent chaos inside the overcrowded housing blocks. 1 year later, this exact argument about maintaining order would become their primary and completely useless defense line at the Nuremberg trials. The women never stopped stripping their victims of human dignity, even as the front line collapsed around them. The overseers spoke about their horrific daily routines as if they had performed a noble public service. They believed their own desperate lies. Ordinary guards clung to cheap illusions, but Maria Mandl knew the truth. 7 years ago, she was a god. She owned the parade ground. Now she stared at her neat journals with animal terror. Former boss Johanna Langfeld had fled months ago. Mandl stayed. She ruled the guards alone. Picture her just weeks earlier. A spotless uniform, the sharp clack of her boots in the corridor. She calmly ticked off punishment rosters. Now those very pages sparked blind panic. Her hands shook. She arrived in 1938, a ruthless Austrian recruit. Fear fueled her rapid rise. Mandl logged everything, every beating, every selection. Her extreme pedantry built a bloody career. It also sealed her fate. Those exact files guaranteed her death by hanging in 1948. Escape was impossible. The paper trail left 0 doubts. Her name already occupied a permanent spot on the official Allied list of major war criminals. Maria Mandl stood in the hallway, screaming orders into the void. Her subordinates just kept stuffing clothes into their canvas bags. The distant rumble of Soviet tanks erased the Austrian supervisor's 6 years of strict discipline in a single morning. Her sharp voice echoed down the empty corridor. Nobody paid attention. Before today, a single glare from her meant instant punishment. Now, female guards ignored the morning roll call. Dozens completely failed to report to their posts. The camp hierarchy evaporated. The approaching front line terrified the staff far more than their own commander. Mandl grabbed a passing warden by the sleeve. She demanded immediate obedience. The woman did not salute. The guards simply turned their backs on her. They picked up their heavy bags and silently walked away. Forged travel documents lay on a narrow wooden bed. While Maria Mandl vainly tried to command her fleeing staff, the owner of these fake papers was already slipping away. 24 years. That was the age of the young woman sending prisoners into the gas chambers of early 1945. During the tense night from the 1st to the 2nd of May, Dorothea Binz locked her door to erase her past. She fed every photograph and official record into the burning stove. She had joined the Ravensbruck concentration camp straight from a low-paying domestic servant job. Because Binz was only 24, she had spent her entire adult life learning nothing except torture and murder. The most ruthless guard in the camp stripped away her terrifying authority. She put on the outfit of a simple peasant woman. Her perfectly tailored green uniform hit the floor. She pulled the rough, scratchy wool of a cheap civilian dress over her bare shoulders. Corrupt local bureaucrats and black market dealers had prepared her new background weeks in advance. Binz buttoned a gray coat. She held her fake identity book under a dim lamp and verified the counterfeit ink stamps. The disguise was ready. She picked up a modest leather bag and stepped out into the chaotic collapse of Germany. She walked out of the camp gates. She folded her blouses into neat little squares. She packed her suitcase with the calm precision of a factory worker ending a normal shift. While Dorothea Binz frantically bought forged passports, Greta Buzel chose a completely different route. She decided she could just return to her old life. She joined the camp staff in 1940. For 5 years, she managed the transport paperwork. She convinced herself this desk job made her innocent. She never swung a club. She never poured the chemicals into the vents. She figured the Allies would easily forgive a female clerk. Her survival strategy relied on pure delusion. She headed for her family house in Fürstenberg. The town sat practically right outside the barbed wire. It was so close that locals could literally smell the burning bodies drifting from the camp chimneys. Ash covered their roofs, yet she honestly thought the soldiers would never look for a killer there. She grabbed her bag. She just went home. Walking out the front gate was foolish, and running through the dark woods was basically a death sentence. So who actually decided to voluntarily wait for the advancing Allied armies? It was the guards who genuinely believed that international law would somehow protect them. Elizabeth Clem chose the most absurd survival strategy of the entire chaotic night. She had worked at the camp since 1940, and she formulated a very specific legal defense. She gathered a small group of women and convinced them to stay exactly where they were. Clem planned to present herself as a reluctant employee who wore the uniform against her will. She honestly thought that cooperating with the liberating forces would guarantee her a lenient interrogation. Her logic relied entirely on a naive interpretation of the Geneva Convention. Clem assumed the Allied commanders would treat her and her subordinates as standard prisoners of war. But there was a massive flaw in her carefully constructed legal theory. The Geneva Convention explicitly excluded concentration camp personnel from receiving any military protection. But she simply did not know that. She was a professional torturer who expected the Allies to treat her like a captured infantryman. The camp was rapidly falling apart around her while she rehearsed her innocent victim routine. She did not pack a suitcase or look for civilian clothes to hide her identity. Elizabeth Clem stood her ground and waited for the enemy at her guard post. Clem waited, but all personal escape plans hit a wall. Commandant Surin signed one last document, the official evacuation order, a piece of paper no one could execute. He demanded a massive march, move the prisoners west, away from Soviet tanks. But the camp was already dead. Authority dissolved. The female guards panicked. Many just ran away. Local roads were already choked with refugees. Logistics became a nightmare. The sick became a burden. The order ignored them. Guards made their choice. They chose themselves. Posts near the hospital barracks stood empty. Doors swung open. Inside lay hundreds of sick prisoners. The empty infirmary echoed with their faint, dry coughing. No one came. Telephones went dead. Without a functioning administration to enforce the final orders, the entire infrastructure of the camp ceased to exist. 2,000 exhausted women, 50 female guards, and one final march. Commandant Fritz Surin issued his last official directive, driving a massive column of starved inmates out of the camp. It was early afternoon. The heavy iron gates opened in late April 1945. Terrified wardens escorted the prisoners, realizing their famous discipline was fracturing as the Second Belarusian Front advanced. The inmates stepped onto the dirt road, and the air filled with the dry, rhythmic shuffling of thousands of wooden clogs. This nightmare meant there was exactly one guard for every 40 prisoners. Under normal circumstances, this numerical disadvantage would have triggered a violent riot. But the victims were completely starved and physically unable to fight back. The control somehow held firm. The guards pushed them northwest, desperate to stay ahead of the front line while navigating the collapse of the German state. This planned escape route quickly turned into a massive logistical trap. Fleeing civilians, abandoned Wehrmacht trucks, and shattered military units completely jammed the rural roads. Panic stripped away the rules. Some guards lashed out with vicious brutality, wildly beating any prisoner who stumbled in the dust just to assert their vanishing authority. They dragged exactly 2,000 people onto the road. The column dragged through the dirt. A starved prisoner stumbled. She hit the ground hard. An overseer stepped up and raised her pistol. A sharp crack echoed through the quiet spring forest. The gates of Ravensbrück were finally out of sight. That was all it took. SS loyalty vanished instantly. The guards abandoned their ruthless commander, Ruth Neudeck. Every woman in uniform cared only about saving her own skin, but they could not stop killing. The habit ran too deep. Shooting fallen stragglers was not a random act of panic. It was blind obedience to the usual camp rules. Anyone who slowed down the march simply caught a bullet. Fast forward just a few days to early May. When Allied vanguard units finally rolled down these exact dirt roads toward Mecklenburg, they did not need a map to track the fleeing convoy. The death march stretched for tens of kilometers. It turned the entire evacuation route into one continuous, unbroken crime scene. The cruelty kept working by pure inertia. Fresh bodies littered the ditches. Each victim had a point-blank wound to the back of the head. The guards thought they were just clearing dead weight to speed up their escape. Instead, they were leaving a permanent physical record of their guilt. Allied forensic teams photographed the roadside corpses and logged their exact locations. These bodies were immediately entered into the official military record as the first physical evidence of the massacre. Those roadside corpses bought the guards just a few hours. Then the march fell apart. May 2nd, the exact day their power evaporated. Without the concrete walls and the barbed wire, their authority meant nothing. The fear stopped working. Starving prisoners simply stopped listening. The guards suddenly realized they stood exposed. No backup, no watchtowers, just them and the advancing Soviet tanks. By evening, the discipline vanished entirely. Years of brutal camp order collapsed in the dirt. The legendary solidarity dissolved into blind panic. Every woman looked out only for herself. When Allied investigators later pieced this timeline together, they found wildly contradictory testimonies from the surviving guards. They eagerly sold each other out. They blamed their commanders. Nobody wanted to take the fall. Tanks closed in. The guards made their final choice. They stripped off their crisp, ironed uniforms. They grabbed forged papers and false identities. They ran. They pulled on dirty civilian dresses right inside the massive crowds of fleeing refugees. But shedding a uniform was not enough. Hundreds of female guards hit a dead end in the dark woods. They sat around the exact same campfires as the very people they had tortured just 24 hours earlier. Awkward truces formed. Survival demanded immediate cooperation. Then the frantic purge began. Why burn official documents in the middle of a forest if you were merely following lawful instructions? The answer was obvious. They knew they were committing crimes. Women kneeled in the damp dirt. They desperately struck matches. Thick folders filled with transfer lists and execution rosters went straight into the flames. The guards glanced nervously over their shoulders. The starving prisoners watched them in silence. The sharp smell of burning paper mixed with the cold night air. Gray flakes of ash floated up. They settled right on the terrified faces of the former executioners. For years, these women justified their brutality as a regular state duty. Now, they destroyed the proof of that duty. Yet the math worked against them. The Ravensbrück administration complex held hundreds of kilograms of meticulous records. Daily slave labor quotas. Tens of thousands of forced medical experiments. You cannot quietly incinerate a massive mountain of paper in a single night. The guards tossed their identity booklets and daily rosters into the glowing embers. By destroying the paperwork, they confessed that those directives were entirely illegal. Every burning page was a silent admission of guilt. Morning came. The fires died down. The wind blew through the campsites and exposed the charred remains of the panic. Half-burned edges of official state forms lay scattered in the dirt. Black ink and round eagle stamps were still clearly visible on the surviving scraps. The ash hid nothing. Fire could not erase the crimes. The ash failed to hide the truth. So the female guards found a new survival tactic. They started drowning each other. You would expect years of shared SS duty to forge unbreakable bonds among these women. Instead, that supposed sisterhood vanished instantly. They were ready to sell out anyone to dodge a hangman. By the afternoon of May 2nd, the panic peaked. Allied forces were rapidly locking down the main escape roads. The trap was closing fast. During brief rest stops in the dirt, the whispers began. Guards pointed fingers at their closest friends. They claimed the woman sitting right next to them had beaten prisoners harder and faster. The SS command had spent years training these guards to constantly spy on their peers. Reporting a colleague used to guarantee a quick promotion. Now, that exact same condition backstabbing kicked in simply to save their own skin. Rank meant nothing. Senior Overseer Ruth Nudek marched her column into the dark. She expected total obedience from the women she personally trained. But fear always beats loyalty. Her subordinates silently calculated their odds and realized a senior officer was just a dangerous anchor. This frantic rat race created a massive paper trail for the prosecution. Interrogators later tallied the exact cost of this fake camaraderie. The early trial protocols recorded over 300 mutual denunciations. Ruth Nudek peered into the pitch-black woods. She suddenly realized she was entirely alone. The most brutal strike came not from advancing armies, but from her own colleagues. It came from the very women she had personally trained. Over 3,000 female guards passed through the SS camps. Nudek shaped dozens of them at Ravensbruck. She taught them strict discipline. She demanded unwavering loyalty. But ideology shattered at the first sign of real danger. The night evacuation moved slowly. Nudek checked the prisoner column. She turned her head to inspect the line. Her subordinates silently stepped off the dirt path. A faint crunch of dry branches echoed under their heavy boots. They faded into the dense night forest. Nudek looked back. An empty spot by a massive tree remained where her patrol had stood just a minute ago. The trainees calculated their treason perfectly. They waited for a remote stretch of road. They knew their fanatical commander would never leave the prisoners to hunt them down. Fanaticism blinded her. She genuinely believed in her dark duty. She expected the same blind faith from her students. But cold survival instantly erased years of rigid indoctrination. Her recruits simply walked away to save their own lives. She stood alone in the freezing dark before an abandoned column of prisoners. Nudek froze alone. Hildegard Leischer changed tactics entirely. How do you buy the silence of victims you tortured for years? Leischer thought one ration was enough. Yesterday she beat people to death. Today she smiled and offered food. Inmates called her Bloody Brigitte. She was ruthless. Now she walked along the column. She handed out stale bread. Dried blood still stained her hands. She tried to rewrite history. The lie failed. Power evaporated. Leischer desperately believed that a sudden act of kindness could somehow erase years of documented cruelty. Nobody believed it. When a cheap crust of bread failed to buy silence, the women immediately changed tactics. They started inventing new lives. Yesterday's ruthless overseers suddenly called themselves secret resistance agents. By the evening of May 2nd, the evacuation columns dissolved into pure chaos. The guards abandoned their posts. They understood exactly what the approaching Allied officers wanted to hear. They methodically crafted elaborate lies. Some declared lifelong communist sympathies. Others swore they only tortured prisoners under the threat of execution. A few even fabricated Jewish roots. Appropriating this specific heritage stood as the highest form of cynicism for the camp staff. They wore the identities of the dead to save their own skin. The investigators soon uncovered dozens of carefully fabricated legends. The boldest lie belonged to Anna Klein, chief overseer. She stepped forward, confident. She handed the Soviet officers a thick notebook. This item represented her freedom. She called it a secret diary, a hidden log of war crimes. The interrogator took the book. He opened the cover. He held the pages up to the light. The room smelled of fresh ink, not damp rot, just sharp chemicals. Forensic science forgives nothing. Chemistry dates ink age down to the week. Klein planned this trick coldly. She faked the entries during the final days, but she missed one detail. The pages were perfectly clean. No mold, no signs of dampness from years of hiding. The Soviet military investigators analyzed the fresh materials and instantly dismantled her carefully constructed legend. While one overseer relied on freshly forged paper, Dorothea Binz executed a completely different exit strategy. How do you vanish without a trace in a collapsing country? Dorothea Binz knew the answer. You completely change your appearance and blend into the crowd. The night of the 2nd to the 3rd of May brought the final collapse of Ravensbrück. The Soviet vanguard was only a few kilometers away. Chaos consumed the roads. But Binz did not panic. Her escape logistics had been ready for months. She sat before a small mirror. Scissors snapped. Binz cut off her distinctive hair. She applied the dark color. A sharp chemical smell of hair dye filled the stifling room of the hideout. She shoved her uniform deep into a canvas bag. A loyalist handed her ordinary civilian clothes. Over 3,000 female guards had passed through the camps. Most ran blindly. Binz moved with cold precision. She pulled out her new papers. Faded purple ink stamps on the fake passport confirmed her new identity. She was now a displaced refugee from the Eastern Territories. This common cover story easily explained her lack of proper registration, but securing such high-quality documents required deep ties with the local administration. The criminal apparatus did not just evaporate, it went underground. Local residents provided safe houses and fresh food. They formed a hidden route for fleeing officials. Binz abandoned her prisoner column during a brief rest stop. She stepped into the darkness. The transition from a high-ranking overseer to a helpless victim was complete. The entire disguise took exactly 4 hours. The very forests where tourists hike today became hidden highways for fleeing criminals in the spring of 1945. Binz was not the only overseer who realized they had to push strictly west and dodge the military patrols. The camp guards scattered into the woods under the cover of darkness. They knew the Soviet army was closing in from the east. Everyone understood that moving toward the American and British lines offered a better chance at survival. The fugitives calculated that the Western Allies would be far more lenient judges than the vengeful Soviet troops. They moved exclusively at night to avoid drawing any unwanted attention from the advancing armies. A flashlight clicked on, illuminating an unfolded map that rustled softly under the dim beam in the pitch-black forest. They avoided main roads and populated towns, sticking entirely to the dense agricultural areas. It was pure calculation. They planned the escape routes weeks in advance, relying on safe houses that local sympathizers maintained. The Elbe River became the ultimate geographical barrier they desperately needed to cross. They did not have to forage or beg for supplies along the way. Wooden boxes packed with canned food lay buried in the dirt along their designated routes. They dug up these pre-prepared caches, ate in silence, and covered their tracks. The fugitives pushed deeper through the thick undergrowth in total darkness. For those who missed the night escape, time ran out. Only one desperate trick remained. To dodge the tribunal, The executioners put on the clothes of the people they methodically destroyed. But you cannot hide a 25-kilogram gap. A healthy guard weighed 60 kilograms. A starving prisoner barely reached 35. Dawn broke on May 3rd. A strong woman frantically tore off her crisp uniform. She picked a filthy striped robe from the mud. She pulled it over her head. Rough, lice-infested canvas scraped against her clean skin. She tried to slouch. She hunched her shoulders and stepped into the gray crowd of survivors, hoping the advancing troops would not notice the difference. The physical evidence remained. Years of fresh meat and warm beds left obvious marks on their faces, making them stick out instantly among the living skeletons. They looked too alive. Real inmates spotted the fakes immediately. Violent brawls erupted between the wooden barracks. Starving women attacked their former tormentors with bare hands. The masquerade failed completely. The pathetic disguise shattered. The second Soviet reconnaissance vehicles breached the perimeter. May 3rd, 1945. Red Army troops rolled into Ravensbruck. They expected a prison. They found an open slaughterhouse. 6 years of precise extermination dissolved into pure chaos. The guards scattered, leaving behind thousands of abandoned prisoners. The sheer scale of the crime scene overwhelmed the arriving soldiers. Combat-hardened infantrymen walked past barracks filled with rusting surgical tools and the fresh traces of medical experiments. Outside, a chaotic mass of humans in SS tunics, civilian coats, and striped robes swarmed across a single dirt square. The meticulous death camp that ran flawlessly for over 2,000 days had completely collapsed in just 48 hours. No stolen uniform could cover up this level of atrocity. The wardens tried to blend into the misery they had engineered. It did not work. The evidence was too massive to burn, and the survivors were too loud to ignore. Military doctors set up emergency tents. Soviet units began sorting the thousands of people across the camp grounds. Maria Mandl presses into the brick wall. She wears plain clothes. She tries to vanish into the ocean of liberated prisoners. But one sudden movement betrays her. An emaciated woman raises a trembling hand and points directly at the disguised guard. On May 3rd, Soviet and Allied soldiers did not need complex searches to find the perpetrators among thousands of people. The victims did the work for them. Allied forces launched a massive identification sweep. Former guards put on striped uniforms. They smeared dirt on their faces. The trick failed. Well-fed bodies could not mimic years of relentless starvation, and their natural physical strength betrayed them instantly. Survivors walked past the ranks. They could barely stand. They pointed out every face they remembered. The living evidence closed the trap. Soldiers drag a healthy woman with a terrified look out of a crowd of starving inmates. She panics. The victims watch her fall apart. An armed convoy surrounds the identified guards and leads them away. How do you find an executioner in a ruined Europe? Hiding among the emaciated survivors turned out to be a fatal idea, because the victims clearly remembered the faces of the women who sent them to the gas chambers. Allied intelligence immediately launched a massive manhunt across the devastated continent. Officers formed special units to track down the fleeing guards before they could disappear into the chaos. The civilian dresses and forged papers provided only a temporary illusion of safety for the camp staff. Some women managed to run further away and evade capture for a while. Dorothea Binz slipped through the initial dragnet and hid in remote areas for several months. But the investigators refused to let the trail go cold. Intelligence officers recruited countless informants from the massive crowds of displaced people. You could hear the constant rustling of glossy photographs as agents handed them out to hungry refugees at every checkpoint. The hunters knew that someone would eventually recognize the fugitive guards and point a finger. The executioners constantly looked over their shoulders, realizing that their civilian disguises meant nothing. Time was running out. Military police translated the long intelligence lists into multiple languages. Officers pinned the names of the wanted women onto wooden bulletin boards. Allied soldiers actively distributed the updated rosters of suspects throughout the sprawling refugee camps. Soviet soldiers kicked open the heavy wooden doors. Light sliced through the dusty barn. A woman backed into the shadows. She gripped forged Austrian documents. She frantically swore she was just a displaced refugee, claiming she even risked her own life to protect the camp inmates. The surviving prisoners standing outside simply looked at her and pointed their fingers. The wanted list caught the slow ones first. People like Maria Mandl. A Soviet soldier grabbed her papers and immediately noticed the crude ink. Then he stared at her clothes. The civilian dress fit perfectly. Clean fabric, zero mud. Against the filthy straw, she looked ridiculously neat. While genuine refugees dragged themselves across the ruined continent for weeks in rags, Mandl still looked perfectly healthy and well-fed. She played the victim. She told the officers she fled from Austria, but Allied investigators already pinned her actual hometown of Munskirchen on their maps. Her capture proved a pathetic truth. The top camp bosses possessed no real exit strategy. They simply threw away their tailored uniforms, hoping a quick costume change would erase their crimes forever. Over 100,000 surviving women recognized Mandl's face on sight. Mandl's capture sparked a chain reaction. Dozens of guards hit the cells. The shift was brutal. For years, they decided the fates of thousands. Now, they trembled. The interrogation process crushed their arrogance. No more whips, no more commands. Just the sharp echo of investigators' footsteps pacing endlessly across the interrogation room floor. Allied forces demanded answers. The women complied. They sat frozen in their chairs, forced to stare at the exact people they were trained to hate. Their last 24 hours of freedom outside Ravensbruck evaporated. Their total power vanished. The transition broke them. They panicked. Their iron confidence shattered in exactly 48 hours. While the arrested women sat in holding cells, British and American officers hunted down what the guards failed to burn. Investigators conducted thousands of interrogations. Translators recorded thousands of interviews with survivors. Allied teams pushed deep into the camp. They found the mass graves first. Over 90,000 victims perished behind these wire fences. Photographers documented the slaughter. Medical units examined the corpses and logged evidence of horrific medical experiments. SS doctors had sliced open healthy legs and rubbed glass into the muscle. Survivors led troops straight to the execution walls. Soldiers mapped every trench, every single ash pile. The guards swore they had no choice. They played the victims. But the leftover paperwork crossed out any claims of forced service. Duty rosters proved they took extra shifts. Ink signatures tied them directly to the killings. The SS tried to destroy the archives before fleeing. They dumped ledgers into the ovens. The documents survived. Photographs of mass graves landed directly on the investigators' tables, and the arrested women suddenly found their voices. Why did these fierce ideological Nazis decide to cooperate with the enemy? They were desperately trying to save their own necks. The interrogations in British holding centers quickly turned into a cynical race of betrayals. Former supervisors eagerly traded the exact locations of their hiding colleagues for a chance at leniency. They sat across from Allied officers and spun elaborate tales about being helpless victims forced into uniform. The strategy was simple. They had to feed the British interrogators enough concrete names to prove their worth. At the same time, they meticulously steered the conversation away from the prisoners they had personally beaten to death. The official interrogation protocols filled up with endless tearful claims of being forced executors who simply followed strict directives from Berlin. Every woman pointed her finger at someone higher up the chain of command. They hoped the investigators would focus on Camp Commandant Joseph Kramer instead of the ordinary guards. They traded loyalty for survival without a second thought, entirely abandoning the brutal solidarity they once shared on the roll call square. Sitting in cold interrogation rooms, the former guards picked up their pens. They signed sworn statements against the very women they had served alongside for years. Those betrayed confessions built the stage for the Hamburg process. In 1946, a British judge opened the session inside the Curio House. The sharp crack of his wooden gavel silenced the room. He stared down from the bench. 16 women sat in the dock. 16 accused faced over 100 witnesses. The British Military Tribunal made history. This was one of the first times female camp staff faced mass prosecution. The women stuck to a desperate script. They played the victims. They claimed total ignorance. They swore they only followed directives to survive. But the investigators did not argue. They simply presented the paperwork. Prosecutors laid down the captured camp records. Then the survivors took the stand. Over 100 women stepped up to the microphone. They pointed directly at their former guards. The formal legal mechanics crushed the defense. Every lie met a terrifyingly detailed memory. The court matched survivor accounts with signed interrogation logs. The procedure left zero room for denial. The final verdict established a dark reality. The guards did not act out of blind obedience. The tribunal proved they exceeded their orders out of personal cruelty. She chose who lived and who died on her own. Yet in court, she played the victim. Out of 16 women in the Hamburg dock, one face made even hardened prosecutors flinch. Dorothea Binz. She ran when the gates fell. She hid in the post-war chaos. But hunters caught her in 1946. Now she faced the tribunal. Binz stuck to a rigid script. She repeated rehearsed phrases about protecting state security and following strict commands. Fellow guards like Ruth Closius used the exact same excuse to hide their crimes. They had no choice, just following orders. But the evidence proved otherwise. Senior overseers never waited for instructions from above. Women like Maria Mandl and Dorothea Binz held independent authority to punish and execute. They did not follow rules. They invented them. The cruelty was a personal choice. Every beating came from their own dark initiative. The lies cracked. Survivors stepped up. Violette Lecoq pointed directly at the dock, describing exactly how the guards selected her for a brutal beating over a minor rule violation. Dorothea Binz kept hiding behind the excuse of strict orders, but that fragile defense shattered the moment the French survivor took the microphone. Lecoq spoke quietly in her native language. She paused every few seconds so the British military court could process the horrifying details. Then the sharp voice of the translator echoed through the quiet courtroom, converting those traumatic memories into harsh German. Binz sat perfectly still in the prisoner's box, forced to listen to her own sadistic choices being broadcast to the whole room. The British judges paid exceptionally close attention to every single word coming from the witness stand. Lecoq was a hardened veteran of the French resistance who survived the worst blocks of Ravensbruck. Because of her political background, her detailed testimony carried the highest priority for the Allied prosecution team inside the Hamburg Curio House in 1946. She explained how the guards actively enjoyed inventing new ways to inflict pain. The methodical translation turned her emotional testimony into a cold, undeniable record of personal cruelty. No bureaucratic excuse could erase this evidence. Faced with direct eyewitness accounts, the female guards desperately tried to twist their stories. They claimed they only wanted to maintain basic camp discipline. But their true mindset bled through the cracks of their rehearsed statements during the intense cross-examination. They could not hide the deep ideological conditioning that had justified their everyday violence. Even while fighting to save their own necks from the gallows, the guards slipped up. Dorothea Binz leaned toward the courtroom microphone and casually labeled the starving prisoners a filthy plague. While a survivor sank Dorothea Binz, Maria Mandl's own ink destroyed her. Prosecutors placed pieces of paper on the wooden desk, execution orders. At the bottom of every page sat her personal signature. How did Mandl try to justify herself? She called herself a protector of the prisoners. During cross-examination, she spun a desperate lie. She claimed she shielded starving inmates from harm. She preached mercy while looking directly at the death warrants she had authorized. Black ink on yellowed paper. The SS had tried to burn the archives. Guards lit massive bonfires before the Soviet tanks smashed through the camp gates. They wanted to erase the past. But investigators sifted through the ruins. They recovered the lists. They matched the dates. The defense shattered. The guards hoped the fire would hide their crimes, but the surviving paper trails proved they were active executioners. The tribunal delivered 39 guilty verdicts. 1947 closed the entire matter for good. Hundreds of ink signatures and sworn testimonies left the tribunal with only one inevitable outcome. Military police transported the condemned women to the high-security block at Hamelin Prison. Guards marched Dorothea Binz and Maria Mandl down the bare brick hallways toward the execution chamber. British executioner Albert Pierpoint secured the thick ropes and calculated the exact drop for each prisoner. The sudden metallic bang of the opening trap door echoed through the cold stone corridor. The judges handed down incredibly long prison terms to the other accomplices who successfully avoided the gallows. These trials destroyed the excuse of following orders, establishing international laws that held ordinary individuals personally responsible for committing atrocities. Wearing a state uniform could no longer shield anyone from facing the direct consequences of deliberate murder. Yet this final outcome sharply contrasts with their highly coordinated escape plans from just weeks earlier. Before Allied troops arrived, these guards packed stolen civilian clothes and carefully mapped out their escape routes. They applied the exact same ruthless initiative they once used to organize the daily camp executions. The surviving documents trapped them. Their false alibis entirely failed. The hangman executed the sentences. Picture a quiet hotel maid or a factory worker. Suddenly, she dictates who lives. The hangman finished his work in 1947, but investigators still faced a chilling puzzle. Who were these women before the camps? Post-war psychological profiles gave the answer. They were just clerks. Nobody forced them. The change happened step by step. Ideological training erased their empathy. Desensitization worked through daily routine. Violence became a mundane habit. They saw prisoners as animals. Beating people became a normal chore. The moral blindness was total. Their testimonies exposed the dark truth. No remorse, no hesitation, just cold facts. The death camps operated efficiently because they relied entirely on the voluntary participation of rank-and-file staff. They murdered people every single day for years, yet stood in the courtroom calling themselves protectors of society. Former clerks and factory workers had mutated into ruthless sadists. But even with the hangman's noose waiting for them, these women did not realize their guilt. Prosecutors read the grisly trial transcripts aloud, while witnesses described lethal injections and crushed skulls. The defendants just stared. They looked into the void with an entirely empty, emotionless gaze, while survivors recounted their worst nightmares. Military psychologists studied the interrogation records line by line to understand this psychological mutation. They analyzed the faces of the condemned women, searching for a single drop of empathy. The doctors found nothing but deep patterns of denial and aggressive justifications of their violent duty. Even during private conversations in their cells, the former guards strictly used dehumanizing terms. They refused to call their victims humans, referring to them only as cargo or inventory. This was not a desperate legal strategy to avoid the gallows. Their personal identities had completely fused with the fallen regime. Decades later, psychologist Albert Bandura scientifically formalized this exact mental process as moral disengagement. The human brain deliberately shuts down emotional responses to extreme cruelty. This mental block allowed everyday people to commit atrocities without losing a minute of sleep. The totalitarian ideology had permanently rewired their minds. The damage was irreversible. Allied investigators interrogated dozens of female perpetrators across multiple detention facilities. Out of all those exhaustive interviews and final statements, prosecutors recorded exactly 0 cases of genuine remorse. The utter lack of guilt showed investigators a terrifying reality. Old laws failed. Principles forged on these makeshift stands operate in international courts today. The defendants repeated the exact same phrase. They just followed orders. The Ravensbruck trials shattered that excuse. Emaciated survivors walked into the courtroom, pointed trembling fingers at their former tormentors and spoke into the heavy microphones. Their raw spoken testimonies became the concrete foundation for entirely new international statutes. These early convictions directly shaped the massive Nuremberg trials. Allies drafted the London Charter in August 1945. The shield vanished. Subordinates now carried the exact same guilt as their high commanders. The gathered evidence permanently eliminated blind obedience as a legal defense.